This is the Westside King's Church podcast, where we aim to encounter and embody the surprising grace of Jesus.
Our conversation this evening, as we sort of work our way through this sort of model that we get of TOV churches from Scot Mcknight and Laura Barringer's book Church Called TOV, we're looking at a concept that they push in the book, which I really, really like, but I think has been hugely challenging to the contemporary kind of evangelical church structure, is this idea of being people first, right? As a church, which sounds on one level really obvious, but when you hear that idea of people first, as we sort of kind of ease into talking about that, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it seems like it should just be really obvious. You go into pastoral ministry, you go into pastoral care, and it's just, well, of course, it's people first. You can't do this without people. But I think you're right. There are certain elements like that you have to consider, like what does people first actually mean? And I think it is having a set of values that reflects that people are the most important thing. Church Called TOV, it talks about how nurturing empathy, which you and Tyson talked about, and compassion and grace. And specifically, this chapter talks about sort of resisting that idea to see church primarily as an institution. So I think when we think about putting people first, it's, well, what is it not, right? What, like, looking at it and saying people need to be the priority over and above what the other parts of this are.
And that's so they use this term, which I've heard in a few places, and I think is really worth being aware of, this notion of what's called institutional creep. So you and this is not just something that the church struggles with, right? But you have this organization, and the organization sets up to do particular things. It could be a coffee shop, so it sets up to serve coffee to people. It could be an airline, so it sets up to transit people from one place to another. There's a whole host of things. Or it could be a church, sets up to introduce people and call people into the way of Jesus and live out his kingdom. And then what happens after a while is the institution eventually ends up thinking of itself as more important than its purpose and goal that it's set up for. So all of a sudden, we're here to serve customers coffee, and you start forgetting that, and you start deciding, well, we don't care about the customers anymore, or in church cases, like when empathy or compassion, grace, various of these qualities start to become secondary to the church achieving its mission. So it might be, this church wants to build a building. This church wants to grow to a particular numerical size. This church wants to have a particular, we talked on Sunday morning about worship. The church might have a particular aim or goal in worship. And what starts to happen is the people that are part of the church become secondary to getting that particular thing done, for want of a better expression.
Yeah. I like that you use that term institution creep, because I think what happens when we have institution creep is that it leaves us with the notion sort of that it's optional to have empathy, compassion, and grace, that those are things that we can kind of turn up and we can turn down, just dependent on how valuable they are, right? Well, if empathy fits here, then great. But if it doesn't, if it's getting in the way of me reaching kind of, my goals, then I can kind of just turn that one down, or I can omit it for a while.
Yes.
And I think also with institution creep, we will always have a different set of rules of who belongs and who doesn't. And we start to see people and evaluate people based on how they serve the institution. So productivity, talent, high capacity, even extroversion, oftentimes is held up as a higher standard than some of the other things, extrovert versus an introvert, right? Because those are characteristics that are good for programs. They're good for institutions. And maybe they're easy to measure too.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And that's an interesting thing, isn't it? About how do you, as an organization, reach your goals, and how do you then know whether you're reaching your goals? And then what starts to happen is you start to hire people, you start to promote people, you start to value people who are better at helping you reach your goals than not reach your goals. So let's say your goal is that we're going to, I'm trying to think. Let's keep it tied into, Sunday morning, for example, when we're talking about worship. There's a lot of churches out there are looking at the model that we see from organizations like Hillsong and Bethel Music and Elevation Music. So churches where the band become recording artists, right? So if you decide, hey, that's our goal for a church, right? So we're going to produce an album. Immediately that will start to shape the type of people that you want involved in your worship band. And additionally, it will then shape the type of people you don't want involved in your worship band. So you don't want that drummer that's going through a messy relational situation because there's always all this pastoral work to do with them. So let's leave them aside and we'll do something else. If you're in a situation where you want to grow your church to a particular number of people, then that's always going to be slowed down. And I think you could speak to this from a pastoral care point of view. The more pastoral care you need to do of people, the slower you'll get your goal, I say in inverted commas, achieved. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think, I think that's exactly right. And I think sometimes it's why we lean so heavily on programs. And sometimes we will default to programs. And it's not that programs are inherently, all bad or anything like that. There are good things about programs, and there are great programs that can run. But I think too often we will default to programs well, if we can get all this one kind of person in a group, in a room, we can set a program that they have to follow. And we can get them from point A to point B and move them along this program. And then hopefully at the other end of it, we will have achieved the result we want. And we will feel like, we've succeeded because this person has completed the program. But the problem with that is that people, people don't exist in isolation. And it requires proximity to people to understand, I think, what the needs are. So the problem where programs, that happens with programs is it assumes a lot of things about people. And people come in as full human beings with stories and backgrounds and all sorts of things to them and intricacies. And when we don't have proximity to that, when we stand at a distance and sort of insert a program instead of being with people, truly being with people, the end result, it might make us feel better that we've, checked a box, but I don't know that it meets the needs quite as well as actually, being with people. Brian and I had a conversation. We're leading conversations on grief in November. And we had a good conversation about grief and about the art of being with people. And it really is an art of being with people. It seems that's just a really intuitive thing to do, but it's not. It's not always intuitive. And it requires that word that I used, which was proximity. And I think, you look at Jesus and so many of the stories there, and so many of them had to do with the proximity to people, the woman at the well, and Zacchaeus up in the tree. I mean, he tells him I need you to come down because I have to have dinner with you. Right. Or he walks through a crowd and is so close to people that a woman can reach out and touch him. Right. And so this proximity piece, I think, is just so important when it comes to caring for people. And I think institutions that creep, I think that they're not all bad, but that creep is what contributes, I think, to us backing away from people. It creates the distance between us and people, and it doesn't happen, overnight. It's called the creep because it actually creeps in. It we compromise bit by bit. We find ourselves unable to avoid it because we don't really see it coming.
Well, so and that to me seems like a really interesting, point to not miss, is that because it's a creep, it happens slowly, it happens gradually, and actually for many of the people involved in it, it probably happens unintentionally. So you take let's talk exclusively about church, because that is what we're talking about in the series. I know a lot of churches that have lost their way and have become highly institutionalized to the extent that they're hurting their congregants. The congregants that don't fit the bill that they're looking for end up, being elsewhere. I've had situations where, going back to my time in England, people turning up in our church, Christians turning up in our church and saying, like, we've joined your church because we were at this other church, and the demands on us at this other church as to what they needed us to be, what they needed our availability to be, was beyond what we could cope with in our life right now. So we've left and come somewhere else. So I remember talking to this young couple, and essentially, to be considered, kind of really committed to the church, the attendance requirements, the involvement requirements were so high, and they just started a family, and they're like, we can't be out this many nights in a week and both have jobs and look after our family. And when they kind of broached this subject with the leadership, it was either you're in and with us, or you're not with us, therefore you're out. So they left the church and came to the church that I was part of the pastoral team on, and we were just happy to have anybody come, so we had no standards at all. And but the funny thing was, I knew the leaders of the church that they'd come from, and they were like good people. They wanted people to find Jesus. They wanted to impact their community for Jesus. They wanted to see the kingdom of God happen. They fundamentally believed that following Jesus was a better way of life for your health, for your way of being. But so I think if you said to them, yeah, but you've had institutional creep, something's happened that you're now not valuing people over your program, that would have been shocking to them to even suggest that was the case, because it just sort of happens subtly and gradually, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to make excuses for people there, but I think it's important that we don't, it feels to me anyway like it's important that we don't say, oh, these people have intentionally gone out to not care about people.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's sort of the alarming thing about it and why it needs attention, because, if we saw it coming, if it was something that you easily look at and be like, oh, I noticed that we're doing this, we got to stop. I mean, that would make it so much easier if it was that noticeable, right? What makes it dangerous, what makes it insidious is that you don't notice. It's those just small incremental changes. And that story that you just shared, I think, it reminds me that we always make statements, whether that is consciously or subconsciously, about who belongs. And I think there's so many times we don't even realize that we are making that statement, but it's everything from the types of programs we offer, the times we offer them, right? You offer Bible study only on, weekday, during the daytime, right? Well, you're making the assumption who can be there. You're actually programming in order to bring in a specific demographic, and making a statement of, well, we don't care if this other demographic can't make it at this time, right? Whereas if you're offering multiple times for Bible studies, that's just an example. But even our building talks about who belongs and who doesn't. Is your building accessible? Hospitable communities. There's just so many ways. The list could go on and on about all those ways that we consciously or subconsciously make statements of who belongs in our community.
Yes, and even like you say, even with the building thing, I think about that so often when I go to coffee shops. It's amazing how you can sort of tell. Phil Odd and I met at a coffee shop just the other day there, and every single seat in the coffee shop was decidedly uncomfortable, and all of the tables rocked ever so slightly. And we decided by the end that this was done purposefully because the coffee shop's not that far from the university. And we were like, I think they're trying to avoid students arriving here and just spending the whole day here. Whereas you go into another coffee shop and there's sofas everywhere, and it's almost like they're saying to you, yeah, stay as long as you want, right? And now you mentioned a story just there. In your examples just a few moments ago, which I think is really interesting parallel, the story of Jesus walking through the crowd and the woman that reaches out and touches him. I think and I'm always careful of taking a story out of its context and trying to apply it to a modern problem, but at the same time I think that's what use of the Bible asks of us. Like, what does this mean for us today? But so that story from Mark chapter 5 is a really fascinating one. Jesus is approached by an influential character in the community. Jesus, we know, is a character who is perceived as problematic by the community. He's causing trouble in various contexts that he lives in. But one of the senior sort of characters in the community, a synagogue leader, comes to Jesus and asks for his help because his daughter is sick. And so this is the kind of thing that Jesus would be really helpful for Jesus' mission. Get a high-ranking local official to be on side with you. So for program Jesus, this is a really good opportunity. It's a really great moment. This is what we're here for. We'll get this whole town on side if we get this synagogue official on board. But while walking through the crowd, this woman reaches out and touches Jesus, and he stops the whole program to spend some time with this woman, and he heals her. The net result of the delay is they now hear that the little girl that they were initially setting out to help has died. Now, the way the story ends, Jesus raises the little girl, but Mark makes this really interesting point because that the girl was 12 years old, and the woman who had been sick for 12 years. And it's interesting how Mark wants to point that that's the feature of Jesus that is significant here. Jesus doesn't seem to be bothered that this is the influential person's daughter, and this poor person who has no influence. They're both the same in Jesus's eyes. But I don't know if you resonate with that story, but to me, the story feels like an example of Jesus modeling what avoiding institutional creep looks like. He treats people first. And this woman, who could be perceived as a hindrance to achieving the goal, is treated with exactly the same focus as the quote-unquote goal itself. I mean, does that resonate?
Yeah, and like you said, kind of as you're introing that, like, it would be good for the program if Jesus would just, get on with it and and perform, a miracle. And I can understand, sort of that line of thinking, because I even experienced that in terms of, not that I'm performing miracles, but just like, you get caught up in the program of stuff, right? It's like, well, I can't return that call yet because I've got this and this and this to get to, right? So I get that how it creeps in there and how, just how distracting it can be. There's just thinking of this is how many times Jesus is moved to compassion. And there was what did it say that the understanding of compassion, the word being used for compassion, is sort of like this describes an inner organ turning with pain. As you see human suffering.
Yes.
So that always just really captures me, this idea that, again, with that proximity and that we're talking about with Jesus, and it's like, if you don't have that proximity, right, that compassion is removed. I mean, I can see something on a television or I can hear a story, but that actual inner organ turning with pain, when seeing human suffering.
Yeah. The Greek word for compassion is splanchnidzomai, and splanchnids is literally your intestines. That's
right.
Really the splanchnids is your intestines. So there is, just to resonate with what you're saying, the Greek idea of emotion is something very of compassion rather is something very visceral. It's something that happens to you. So whereas what we tend to do is we think of compassion as very much a cerebral idea, don't we? It's a thought process that Jesus has.
Yeah.
He looks at these crowds and he has a thought process. And I'm not saying that Jesus doesn't have thoughts about people that need compassion, but it's interesting that the description, and you don't want to overplay that because that's how words work, but that rooted somewhere in that description is that something is happening to you, But that's true in English as well. I mean, literally, compassion's a Latin word, so we go from Greek. It feels like we're back in seminary now, Christin, doesn't it? But we go from Greek splanchnizomai, which is to be moved in your insides. There's a painful, visceral response. Compassion, the Greek, the Latin com means with, and passion is, we talk about the passion of the Christ, the suffering of the Christ. So it's, compassion is to suffer with that person. There's still an element of it having something visceral and real, and like you say, that's a television screen, your phone or tablet screen creates a lack of proximity. And I think in church life, programs can create a lack of proximity, and there's a lot of excuses that we can create to create a lack of proximity. It's easy. I mean, I could say it like this. I finished teaching sermons on Sunday morning and kind of mooch my way down off the front of the stage and see who wants to come and talk to me. And you never know who's going to want to come and talk to you at that particular moment to tell you something that's gone on in their week, or something that they thought about your sermon, or something that they thought about you. And it would be, and sometimes I come away from those conversations and like, I'd say this, and I mean this, this isn't a good quality of me, but sometimes I come away and go, why do I do this? Right? Because, you're sort of tired and exhausted from teaching, and then somebody comes and they want to have some kind of harsh conversation with you.
Yeah.
But I always try and tell myself that sense of, and I'm no genius at this, please, I'm not trying to do that thing where, look at me, the great example. I would very often rather run and hide. But if I do run and hide, then there's a sense in which I'm saying, this is a program that we're delivering here at church, not a gathering of people wherein, we as humans have responses to things, and we want to talk to people about the responses that we have, and they don't fit in boxes in programs and stuff like that. And so I think it's difficult, and there's almost a sense for all of us. There's that person at your workplace that you see them coming and you're like, oh no. And, we all like to remove our proximity sometimes, don't we?
Yeah. And that just reminds me, like, it's a good reminder for me too, because you're right. We do like to create kind of space, especially when we're uncomfortable, especially when we don't have control, and as part of the pastoral life. And I think something that's really important to remember is in this, and I remind myself all the time, that like every person has two things. Every person has woundedness, and every person has giftedness. And, sometimes when we insert people just into programs and we run that way, we can lose both of those things. We can lose the story behind the person. We can lose the ability to actually be with people in their woundedness and walk with them. And, it's part of being a pastor. And honestly, it's one of the most sacred parts of being a pastor, right? Is being able to walk with people in that. And then also you lose people's giftedness, right? Because it kind of puts people into a box, and you miss those things. And so when we talk about, TOV, part of TOV being a people first culture, part of that is recognizing everybody's woundedness and also recognizing everyone's giftedness, and how we incorporate them into the life of the church, not just as people who show up on a Sunday and, consume a product and then leave, but people who are actually deeply embedded within our church. And I don't think we can do that. I don't think we can have people who are embedded within the fibers of the church if we don't understand people's woundedness and giftedness.
I mean, as you say that, I find myself, and this is not me extracting quotes from deep memory, but I was this week, as I'm prepping for this sermon coming up this Sunday, I was reading some sections of Bonhoeffer's book Life Together, which is pretty heavy going work when he talks about community in that. But one of the things he says about community, well, actually, no, it's not what he says about community. It's what he says about leaders of community. And there's this line in it, which I'll just give part of the line and then he can unpack the rest on Sunday morning. But he talks about, he has this line where he says, God hates visionary dreamers. Have you read this bit of Bonhoeffer? I don't know if you have or not. You have the book on your shelf because I borrowed your copy earlier this week because I'd left mine at home. So I know you have it. But he has this line, he says, God hates visionary dreamers, which is such a harsh statement because you think, well, that can't be right because we're always talking about vision and what's our dream. But then Bonhoeffer does this thing, which I think we could interpret into institutional creep, where he says the problem is that the person, and he's writing in the 1930s, so it's, he says the man who has a dream, so forgive the sexism of it, but he says the man who has this dream of community, he ends up loving that dream of community more than the community itself. Right. So the problem that then happens is everyone that's in community or in your community is now judged by you, the leader, by how they're helping you get towards the dream that you have. Right? Whereas Bonhoeffer, he says, and eventually this person becomes an accuser of the community and ultimately an accuser of God and eventually an accuser of themselves. Right? Because people now have a different function. Our take on what a person's doing in our community is different now because what's first is getting towards the visionary dream. And people now are ranked and assessed on whether they hinder that or whether they help with that. And Bonhoeffer basically says, once you've gone down that line, what you end up with is not a church. It's not the Christian community. It's not the community that God wants to call us to. So he then warns about having a vision of community that isn't aligned with the biblical vision of what community is. Pretty harsh, but I think I'm a big Bonhoeffer fan, so I'm biased, but I think there's profound truth in that, and that warning nearly 100 years later still seems very, very apt.
Yeah. And it speaks to a bit of like our own discomfort. Like, what is it about, the programs or the institution, right, that we kind of keep getting pulled back over to. And I think just to kind of go back, I think we said it a bit earlier, but it's part of that measuring goals that you just mentioned as well, right? Where it's just easier to measure those things. It's easier to, are we doing good or are we not doing so good? Are we successful? And we get really uncomfortable when we can't measure that. And that's all pastoral. You talk to any good therapist, and a good therapist can't measure whether or not all of their people that they're seeing are doing well, right? Like if a therapist measured how good of a therapist they were just based on how, somebody comes and sees them, how they're doing at any given point, that could destroy you, right? Where it's just a different measurement when we're talking about people, when we're talking about being with people, that art of being with people, right? And I think it makes us really uncomfortable not to have a measurement for that.
And I think that's why the language of goodness becomes so important.
Yeah.
Because you're now saying, actually, we're going to measure things differently. That might affect our pace. It might affect our achievements. It might affect, a whole host of things. But we're not wanting to step away from that as a value that we need and want to be primary. You and I talked a little bit, and he's Mcknight and Barringer raise him in the book as an example. We talked about Fred Rogers as a kind of modern example of somebody who pursued goodness as a way of being in an industry, the media industry, which is not well known for this. And so I think I said to you just when we were conversing before that like I grew up in a context where we didn't, Fred Rogers wasn't on British television. I also didn't grow up in Britain for a good chunk of my life. So I've come to the Fred Rogers story late. Now, but tragically, a couple of the really big children's TV people from when I was a kid have both been, exposed as being pretty has been prolific pedophiles with systemic programs of abuse happening as part of their TV shows. Right. So it's like, so I think, as I said to you, I think I'm drawn to Fred Rogers as an adult by this sense of, oh my goodness, there's still a TV presenter from people's childhood that's good, right?
And I said to you, I actually don't know that if like the entire human race can handle if something were to happen. Like I think we cling to Fred Rogers being a very good person. I don't think we could handle.
Yes. If there was a story of something bad about Fred, I think we'd all be done. Just pack up and go home. But you picked up a quote from. Well, yes, I'll let you.
It was one of his coworkers, something that stood out to me. So it's sort of in this conversation, I think it can be easy just to like say, oh, programs are bad, and we're talking about greatness, so that means nothing. Nothing can be high quality. And you guys have spoken to this on Sunday mornings as well. Like, we're not talking about, doing poorly at things or not doing things well or not having good quality stuff. And this quote in the book kind of speaks to this. And it's one of Fred Rogers' co-workers. And she says that he was flawed, that he was really, really great, and that he is good. And what I love about that quote is that it makes him human, because it shows, he has flaws. He's a human being. He's not superhuman. He was great at things. You look at Fred Rogers, he had a television show. Tom Hanks has played him in a movie, right? Like, there's greatness there. He had a great show. He's famous, but and he was good is a completely separate category. And it really resonated with me.
And that's why I like this, even the series you're teaching about great to good. It's very important to agree with you on that it's not, oh well, let's just do everything average now, and that will be what God wants. Phil said it on Sunday morning. We want good music. We want it's just that we're not wanting to give up goodness in the process of being great preachers. And listen, I've been to churches where everything was done to a really average level, and they were still not good people. So I've been in churches where people were hurt, people were ignored, the program came first, and they didn't do anything well, right? So it's very important to really assert that sense that the quality of the building, the media, the worship, the teaching doesn't necessarily have to have any bearing on the goodness of, you can have a church. It comes to mind, I was thinking about someone I watched, and had a connection with very vaguely through social media. And they went through a really tough time in their life. And they were a pastor in a smaller church, and they went through this tough time in their life. And it was the local megachurch pastor that he said, without him, I never would have got through it. And this megachurch pastor, you would have heard of him, the super glitzy, kind of high profile church. But this guy's going behind the scenes. That pastor's good. Like, he genuinely cares for people. And conversely, you could have a church that nobody's heard of, and the pastor not put people first. So I really want to resonate with what you're saying. We can separate those two issues of quality of product, for want of a less horrible term, where we say, actually, firstly, let's be good. And from that goodness, let our skills and our gifts, but also our brokenness and woundedness, all kind of mesh together to be the church, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that's really well put.
So in just kind of tracking our way then through Mcknight and Barringer's sort of advice, they talk about sort of putting some pieces in play as an organization, as a church, in order to sort of help us be good and be people
Yeah.
first. So they talk about avoiding. They reference Mitch Randall's work on kind of what he calls theological malpractice, which is to fail to treat people as image bearers of God. Which again, I really found that image quite that metaphor really quite powerful. I don't know if you did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of that is seeing people, what they say, develop Jesus like eyes for everyone, right? And we're recognizing the humanness of people. We're recognizing that they're made in the image of God. We recognize that being made in the image of God, that we have a vocation, right? That and that we all have our place in the church. We all have giftedness, like we talked about before. We all have things that we can offer and things that we can bring to community. And a people first type culture makes that the most important factor. It's and then it also gets into how do we avoid the institution creep. So it outlines kind of 5 areas: treat people as people, and fold others into the community, recognize all people are made in the image of God, treat people as siblings, and develop Jesus-like eyes for people. That treat people as siblings one, I don't know, like everybody has different relationships with their siblings. So I had to my brother and I do not get along very much. We get along well now, but at first I was like, oh, I don't know. But,
yes, treat really people like siblings doesn't necessarily narrow it down that much, does it? Sometimes don't treat people like your siblings.
Yeah, exactly. But what I appreciate about it is that that's honest, right? Because I didn't choose my sibling, and there's times where we've gotten along and times where we haven't, right? But he was still part of the family, and I'm still part of the family, and we still have to function and find a way to be healthy within that family. If we want to have harmony, if we want to be a people first family, then we have to function in a way that we both see each other's flaws, and we see each other's giftedness, and we see each other's woundedness. And it's like that in the church, right? We, there are people that maybe outside of the church, they wouldn't be our best friend or somebody that we would want to go out for lunch with, but when they're your sibling, we're asked to do something different with that, right? Where they are part of the family, and we have to find a way to work with that and to honor the fact that they are an image bearer and just as much of a part of the family.
Yeah, I think that's there's that old saying, isn't there, that your friends you can choose and your family you're stuck with, and there's actually there is something profound in that sense of what if we did look at our church community as our family. Now, I think there's a lot of work needs to be done there from us as leaders. Like, let's talk exclusively about Westside for a while. I think there's something for us to be done as leaders, but then also as a community to maybe change our perception of what we're part of by being part of Westside King's Church. So, is this something we just turn up to for a service once a week, or is it actually a church community that we want to be part of, where we connect to, we serve in, we grow in, we meet people in, like this. There's different ways to do church as a person who comes to church, where you could just see it as a place you go to, as a customer, but there's also a way to look at it as a community. And I think what happens often in church life, which can then start to become cyclical of some of the unhealth of church life, is when me as a church member starts to see myself as a customer of the church, then and this sense of, and if I don't get what I want exactly from this church, I'll go somewhere else. What then happens is leaders then start to think, okay, how do we put on programs that ensure you'll keep coming here? But then in the process of putting on those programs to ensure you keep coming here, that doubles down on the idea that we're here to offer you a product that you'll like and want to keep engaging with, right? Whereas when you take on a family metaphor of church, which is a significant church metaphor in the New Testament, when you take on a family metaphor, it's kind of like, well, this is your family. So, how do we grow towards being becoming what we'd like to be, rather than I wonder if I can find a family that would better suit what I'd like a family to be like. And and we've all had that at some point in our lives. So you've went to your friend's house and decided their family is distinctly cooler than your family, and, and you wish maybe that was just my childhood. No, I love my family, but you've had that sense where you had that friend and their parents seem to take their family on better vacations than yours or something like that, and there's that desire to want to move families, but we know we can't. But one of the dangers that's happened with our privilege, really, in the modern context, has been that you don't actually need to commit to a church. Right? You don't need to commit to a family. It's actually quite easy to transition between communities, maybe because whatever we're doing there isn't entirely community. It's something else, and therefore moving churches becomes, akin to moving banks or supermarkets. Actually, I shouldn't say moving banks. I read a statistic recently that said you are more likely to change your marriage partner than you are your bank over the course of your life. So that's a stunning statistic. Wow. So maybe we need to go learn something from banks. Although I'm suspicious the reason nobody changes banks is they're just so hard to deal with. Nobody.
This is impossible. You have no. Yeah. No, I think that all that is so true, and I do see that that cycle of offering programs and people wanting programs, and so you offer more programs, right? And in an attempt to keep people happy, and and I even know in my own time going to church, throughout my life, we've been to a few, and I could never look back and really say, did I ever feel, growing up, that there was maybe one church that I would say that I felt like we were rooted in, as that it was actual, potential to be a family. And yeah, it's unfortunate, right? Because I think that there's so much more there. And sometimes that's part of, being honest, that's sort of part of the feedback I've gotten, right? Because in a larger church, we're not like a mega church, but we're a bit of a larger church. And so people can find it a little bit hard to get connected. So it really is a challenge to kind of resist going, okay, well, people really want to get connected, and really being driven by, the compassion of that and wanting to help people get connected, and go, okay, well, let's just put in a program, right? Because that's gonna fix it. I don't know that I have an answer necessarily. There's
even questions then about how. I mean, these are difficult questions to ask, but is it possible? Let me just ask the question and let's not even answer it. But I think the question. Is it possible that a church becomes too big? Is it possible that there are reasons that we like very big churches, right? And those reasons might not be rooted in the gospel in the same level that we would like to think they are. They look very successful from a secular point of view. If you're going to metric things on volume of people turning up, then success would be a bigger church versus a smaller church. Always worth noting that, and I've been to a lot of church conferences over my life, and it's interesting, based on the way people are introduced at church conferences, Jesus would never get invited to speak at a church conference, because the stories that this is how introductions go at church conferences. This is Christin. Christin's a fantastic leader. She has grown a church of 100 people to 3,000 in the last 3 years. And, she's got these amazing programs, and she's on the mayor's speed dial. And we're really glad that Christin's here to speak to us today, right? And I often think when I hear these intros, I wonder how they would do Jesus. This is Jesus. He has 12 people. One of them is plotting to kill him. He did preach a good sermon once. 5,000 people came. He ended the sermon in such a way they all left in one day. He started some riots. A few people tried to kill him after his first. Jesus wouldn't fit the bill of what we would say is successful. And so there's a part of me thinks we as Christians need to be nervous about a system, a model, an understanding that Jesus would look uncomfortable within. And
Mm-hmm.
and that requires creative thinking then from us to say, okay, well, this goes back to good or great. If we cannot pastorally care for, if we cannot missionally work out our calling with this sort of volume of people or whatever, then maybe we need to think more creatively about how we as a community work. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I don't have answers to that, but I think that what we notice is the bigger numerically your organization gets, the risk of institutional creep is higher. Right? The risk of losing people, ironically enough, it becomes easier to be something other than people first, the more people that you have around, because it somehow seems to be more justifiable to say, well, we can't change all of this for one person, right? Because we've got this thing. And that's that little bit of institutional creep, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right.
Bob Osborne used to always say when we were having meetings that God counts people like this. Here's one person. And here's another one person. Oh, and here's another one person. He says God never counts people in tens, 20s, and hundreds. Every single person is a person, right? And that person has their giftedness and their woundedness and their story and their connection. And if we start lumping people into groups, like, this certain, I've heard this, I've read this in books, I've heard this in conferences. There's churches out there that divide up their congregation statistically into what they call giving units, right? So it's like this family, well, they probably all give together, so they essentially are one, even though there's 5 of them, they're one giving unit. And you're thinking, like, goodness me, what a horrendous way to to look at a congregation and to lose the image of God in a person. The fact that there's Christian writers out there talking this way about congregations, like, here's a helpful model to help you look after your church. Well, I don't think you're looking after a church at that point. You're doing something else entirely. When I go to get my oil change in my car, I'm not actually overly bothered, if the oil change guy cares about me. I just like him to do a really good job for the money that we stated and agreed on. And as long as my car's looked after and he's paid, we're all happy. And he looks at me as a customer, and he doesn't, if I turn and go having a really rough day, he doesn't need to respond to that. He can, here's your receipt, see you later. But when churches start to think that way, that, you've started to lose the image of God, knowing that any one person comes to church on a Sunday morning, for example, or a home group or a seminar, they might be bringing all sorts of difficulty and woundedness with them that day. And then the ironic thing is, you could talk to them for 5 minutes, and the very next person that comes has a similarly difficult story. It's not like, well, I've done my one, and that's me for today. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And like, Bob said, God counts one by one by one. Also, like you were saying, how we interact with people is one by one by one. And those programs, those large groups, it removes that oneness, that individual woundedness and giftedness. So
well, it can do. And I think that there's, again, I think with the right approaches, the right attitudes, I have, like I say, I have been to large churches that have great community connection. So we've also got to be careful of not assuming that, but if there was only 50 of us, we'd have this sorted. Right. I went to a church once. I was traveling and I had a free evening. There was a church service on. I went. There was 40 people there. Nobody spoke to me. I went and left. and so, and then conversely, I've wandered into large churches and been invited to people's houses for supper, right? So there's, again, we've got to be careful that if we're saying the number metric isn't as significant as we think it is, that means that small isn't necessarily better than bigger, and big isn't necessarily worse than smaller, and vice versa in all the combinations.
Yeah, and Scot and Laura and Barringer in the book, they do make that distinction, saying, listen, sometimes this is the way it does work out just because of the nature of things. But like you're saying, David, we've been to small churches that do it well. We've been to small churches that don't.
Yeah.
been to big churches that do it well. We've been to big churches that don't. So,
Yeah.
Ultimately we're all struggling in some way or another.
So true. Well, and we know that's true in our lives. We all have had good experiences at Starbucks and bad experiences at some, local, standalone coffee chain, and vice versa, right? It's, the problem is the people you deal with are broken as well, right? And if your church leaders are broken and your church is full of broken people, but also everybody's gifted, that's going to create complexity sometimes, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So, well, Christin, thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, David. Always enjoy it.